Now that you've gotten a basic intro to Power Query, let's keep going with our country's data set by doing some basic transformations so you can get a better feel for the data modeling process. You may continue to follow along with me as I walk through all these steps. As you've probably noticed by now, the data set we're looking at is a list of all the countries in the world, their capitals, continents, regions, area, population, etc. This is a really good beginner's data set for Power BI and Power Query for a few reasons. First, it's a small data set. Second, has a variety of decent data types to look at. And third, it can be used for a lot of different visualization types. It's also a good standalone data set, and it doesn't need much transformation or cleanup. So this will be a nice and easy introduction to data modeling. As we move farther into this course, though, our data sets will come in different shapes and sizes, and our data modeling steps will become progressively more complex to suit those new scenarios. We'll be combining multiple data sets together and completely restructuring them to give us the best possible data model for building our reports. But for today, we'll keep it light and breezy. So let's go to the laptop again. Like we discussed in the last section, the applied steps contain the recipe for our data model. And right now, our recipe is pretty basic. We've imported the data from our CSV file, promoted the first row into our column headers, and changed a few data types. But all of this happened automatically when Power Query first connected to the data source. Now we need to do some additional cleanup. Let's start by removing some columns we don't need. The quickest way to do this is to use the menu that is available in the top left corner of our data table. It's very discreetly located, but when you click on it, you'll see a menu of transformations pop up for our data set. And one of these options is Choose Columns. Clicking this will give us a pop-up window showing all the columns in our data set, and we can just choose the ones we want. In this case, we only need a few columns, so I'm going to unselect everything. Then I'm going to go through the list and select ISO 3, display name, area, and population. In our exercise, we're going to be examining how population and area relate to each other, so these are the only two columns we need. When I click OK, the other columns we did not select are removed from the data set, and a new step appears in our recipe named Removed Other Columns. Now, why would we want to remove columns? We'd want to remove columns primarily to minimize the size of our data model. The more columns you have, the more data Power BI is going to import into your data model. This can affect Power BI's performance when your data model gets big enough. Now, remember that Power BI's XVelocity engine is going to compress this data down to a fraction of its original size. Even the XVelocity engine has its limitations, so you should try to shrink your data model as much as you can before loading it in order to improve the performance of your report. In this case, removing extra columns will help us streamline our data set and is a common data modeling technique for improving Power BI's performance. But keep in mind, we can always go back and add more columns later. In fact, let's do that now. Suppose we forgot to add continent, which we need for our report. Let me show you two ways we can go back and add those to our data model. In the first method, we go to our recipe, or applied steps, and look at the step where we removed the other columns. Notice that there is a gear icon next to the right of the step. If we click on the gear, the Choose Columns window will reopen, and we can just select continent from the list. When we hit OK, you'll see that continent has been added into our table. The second way to edit our recipe is to use the formula bar. If you look directly above the data table, you should see it. If you don't see the formula bar, you can enable it by going to the View tab and selecting Formula Bar. The formula bar shows you the code that results from everything you do in Power Query, and we can switch between the different steps in our recipe and see this code for each one. For instance, if we click on our source step, you'll see some code that is connecting Power Query to our data source. If we click on the most recent step of our recipe, Removed Other Columns, you can see how it uses this Table Select Columns statement to tell Power Query, grab these columns. This language is called M, the letter M, like 007's boss at the Secret Intelligence Service, MI6, and all the James Bond movies. For this course, you don't need to learn M, but as you progress into more advanced Power BI techniques, learning M can be useful, especially as you do things like conditional formulas and advanced filtering. In this case, all you would need to do to add a column back into your data model would be to modify this simple formula using the formula bar. In this exercise, we want to find out which countries are the most densely populated. But first, we need to do a little bit of math. So we're going to add a new column that calculates the population density of each country. Population density is simply a measurement of the number of people divided by the available land. So population divided by area. To create this new column in Power Query, we're going to go to the Add Column tab on our ribbon. Then we're going to select first population and then area. The order in which we select the columns is very important because it tells Power Query which field is the numerator and which is the denominator. Then, once our two columns are selected, we go to that Add Column tab and select the drop-down menu underneath Standard. And then we click Divide. After doing this, you'll see we have a new column in our data set named Division and a new final step added to our recipe. Now, by adding this new column, we have added data to the data set because Power Query is going to calculate population density ahead of time and load it into our data model. Our data set is very small, so this is not a problem in this particular exercise. But adding a column like this in Power Query is actually not the preferred way of handling these types of calculations. I'm doing it this way to illustrate some of the techniques you can use in Power Query. But the preferred method for performing calculations is to do it in Power BI Desktop using something called measures. Measures are dynamically calculated in our report and do not require us to add more data to our data model. We'll discuss measures in greater depth in a later video, and we'll use them to add some great insights to our reports. There's another method in Power BI Desktop called calculated columns, which we'll also cover. So really, there are three different ways to do what I've just done, and in this video, I used what is arguably the least preferable of the three ways. But again, I'm just doing it to illustrate Power Query's capabilities. The step I usually save for last in Power Query is to rename my columns to make them more user-friendly and descriptive. For example, I'm not happy with the display name column, so we're going to rename that country. And we can do that by either double-clicking on the column header or by right-clicking on it and selecting the rename option. And let's do the same thing with area square kilometer and just rename it to area. And finally, let's take the division column we created and rename it as population density. Again, as I'm doing these steps, watch the recipe continue to grow, but also notice how when you do two or more of the same operation back to back, Power Query likes to combine them into one step. We renamed three separate columns, but Power Query only created one renamed column step. And the formula in the formula bar shows all three columns being renamed in one operation. This keeps the steps streamlined and efficient for you. With that last step of renaming the columns, we have a pretty decent data model prepared, so we're ready to load it and start building our report. Stick around for the next video, where we'll introduce you to the Power BI Desktop interface and get ready to start visualizing our data.